Helen Margaret Collins never thought she'd be the type of grandmother to spend her pension money on pop concerts. But at 62 years old, standing in the front row of Soldier Field in Chicago, watching Michael Jackson glide across the stage like he was defying gravity itself, she finally understood why her 8 grandchildren had been begging her for months to go see the King of Pop. What Helen didn't know was that this third concert would change not just her life, but the way an entire arena full of people thought about music, age, and the magic that happens when two unlikely souls connect across a crowded room. It all began in 1984 when Helen's youngest grandson, Tommy, came running into her kitchen with tears streaming down his face. At 8 years old, Tommy was usually tough as nails, the kind of kid who scraped his knees and got right back up. But that Tuesday afternoon, he was sobbing like his heart was broken. "What's wrong, baby?" Helen asked, pulling him onto her lap in the worn recliner that had been her late husband Frank's favorite spot. "Grammy," Tommy hiccuped, "all the kids at school are going to see Michael Jackson, and Mama says we can't afford it. She says maybe next time, but there might not be a next time." Helen had heard the name Michael Jackson, of course. Hard not to when you had 8 grandchildren between the ages of 6 and 16, all of whom seemed to think this young man with the sequined glove was the greatest thing since sliced bread. She'd seen them practicing his dance moves in her living room, sliding across her hardwood floors in their socks, trying to moonwalk like their hero. "Michael Jackson," she repeated thoughtfully. "Isn't he that boy from Gary? The one who used to sing with his brothers?" Tommy's eyes went wide. "Grammy, you know Michael Jackson?" "Well," Helen chuckled, "I wouldn't say I know him, but I remember when he was just a little thing, singing on the Ed Sullivan Show with his family. Your grandfather Frank and I used to watch that show every Sunday night. That little boy had such a big voice." What Helen didn't tell Tommy was that Frank had driven them over to Gary, Indiana, back in 1970, just to see the Jackson family's house. "Imagine that," Frank had said as they drove slowly down Jackson Street. "A family from right here in our backyard, making it all the way to the top of the music world." Now, 14 years later, that little boy was the biggest star on the planet, and Helen's grandchildren were heartbroken that they couldn't see him perform. Helen Collins had been a school teacher for 35 years before retiring in 1982. She'd taught third grade at Beethoven Elementary on Chicago's South Side, and in all those years, she'd learned one thing above all else. When children believe in something with their whole hearts, sometimes the best thing an adult can do is find a way to make that dream come true. That's how Helen found herself standing in line at the Ticketmaster office the next morning, clutching her checkbook and feeling completely out of place among the teenagers and young adults who were chattering excitedly about set lists and backstage passes. "Ma'am," the young man behind the counter said when Helen finally reached the front of the line, "what show are you looking for?" "Michael Jackson," Helen said simply. "The Victory Tour. I need one ticket, please." The clerk looked puzzled. "Just one? Most people are buying multiple tickets." "Just one," Helen confirmed. "The best seat you have available." When he quoted her the price, Helen's heart skipped a beat. $200 was nearly a quarter of her monthly pension check. But she thought about Tommy's tears, about all 8 grandchildren who would be listening to her describe every moment of the concert, and she handed over her checkbook without hesitation. "Section A, row 2, seat 12, the clerk said, handing her the ticket. "You'll be right up front, ma'am. Great view of the stage." Helen tucked the ticket into her purse like it was made of gold. The night of the concert, Helen dressed in her best navy blue dress and her pearl earrings, the ones Frank had given her for their 25th wedding anniversary. She felt nervous as she rode the bus to Soldier Field, surrounded by young people in Michael Jackson t-shirts and single sequin gloves. When she found her seat, Helen was amazed to discover she really was right up front. The stage was so close she could see the individual lights and speakers. Around her, fans were already on their feet, screaming and holding up homemade signs. When the lights went down and that familiar voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, Michael Jackson," Helen watched something magical happen. The young man who walked onto that stage moved with such grace, such confidence, such joy that even Helen found herself clapping along. For 2 hours, Helen watched Michael Jackson command that stage like he was born to be there. She watched him spin and slide and leap through the air, and she understood finally why her grandchildren loved him so much. This wasn't just entertainment. It was art. It was passion. It was a young man pouring his heart out for 80,000 people, making each one feel like he was singing directly to them. After the concert, Helen's grandchildren gathered around her kitchen table like she was reporting from another planet. "Was he really glowing, Grammy?" asked Sarah, the 16-year-old who considered herself the family's Michael Jackson expert. "Did he really moonwalk across the whole stage?" demanded Marcus, who'd been practicing that move for months. "Was it loud? Did people scream the whole time?" wondered little Lucy, who was only 6 but already knew every word to beat it. Helen answered every question with the patience of a woman who'd spent decades explaining the world to children. Yes, Michael seemed to glow under those stage lights. Yes, he moonwalked not just across the stage, but down a runway that extended into the audience. And yes, people screamed, but it was the kind of happy screaming that comes from pure joy. "Grammy," Tommy said quietly, "do you think you'll ever go again?" Helen looked at 8 hopeful faces around her table and realized something. She wanted to go again. Not just for them, but for herself. 3 years later, when the Bad World Tour was announced, Helen didn't wait for her grandchildren to ask. She was first in line at Ticketmaster, and this time she knew exactly what she wanted. "Section A, row 3, seat 10, she told the clerk confidently. "As close as you can get me." The 1987 concert was even better than the first. Michael seemed more confident, more polished, and Helen found herself completely caught up in the music. During Human Nature, she actually found herself swaying to the rhythm. During Man in the Mirror, she felt tears in her eyes as Michael sang about making a change. But something else happened at that second concert. During a quiet moment between songs, as Michael stood at the front of the stage looking out into the audience, his eyes seemed to find Helen's section. For just a moment, Helen could have sworn he was looking right at her. "Probably my imagination," she told herself later, but she couldn't shake the feeling that those famous eyes had actually seen her. What Helen didn't know was that Michael Jackson had indeed noticed her. Between shows, he often asked his security team about memorable audience members, and a well-dressed grandmother in the front row was definitely memorable. "Bill," Michael said to his head of security after the 1987 show, "did you see that older lady? Front section, wearing the blue dress?" Bill Watson had been working with Michael for 5 years, and he'd learned to pay attention when his boss noticed someone in the audience. "Yes, sir. Very distinguished lady. Seemed to be really enjoying the show." "She was at the last Chicago show too," Michael said thoughtfully. "Same section. I noticed her because she was so different from the usual front row crowd." "Want us to keep an eye out for her?" Bill asked. "Yeah," Michael said. "If she comes to the next show, I want to know." 1988, the final leg of the Bad World Tour. Helen Collins, now 64, had decided this would be her last Michael Jackson concert. Not because she didn't enjoy them, but because she was starting to feel self-conscious about being the only grandmother in a sea of teenagers. "This is it," she told her reflection as she got ready for the show. "One last hurrah." She wore her favorite dress, a deep burgundy number that Frank had always said brought out her eyes, and her good pearl necklace. If this was going to be her final Michael Jackson concert, she was going to do it right. Section A, row 2, seat 11. Even closer than before. As the opening act finished and the stage crew began setting up for Michael's entrance, Helen noticed more security personnel than usual moving through her section. One of them, a tall man in a black suit, actually stopped and spoke to the usher near her row. Helen thought nothing of it until the usher approached her during the brief intermission before Michael took the stage. "Mrs. Collins," the young woman said. Helen was surprised to hear her name. "Yes, Mr. Jackson's security team would like to speak with you after the show." "Nothing to worry about," the usher added quickly, seeing Helen's alarmed expression. "Mr. Jackson just wanted to meet you." Helen's heart started racing. "Meet me? Are you sure you have the right person?" "Helen Collins, Section A, row 2, seat 11? Helen nodded, speechless. "Then yes, ma'am. If you're willing, they'll escort you backstage after the final encore." For the rest of the concert, Helen could barely concentrate on the performance. Michael Jackson wanted to meet her? Why? What could the king of pop possibly want with a 64-year-old retired schoolteacher from Chicago? But when the final note of Man in the Mirror echoed through Soldier Field and the lights came up. Helen found herself being gently guided through a maze of corridors underneath the stadium by two very polite security guards. "Right through here, Mrs. Collins," one of them said, opening a door marked "Private." Helen stepped into a room that was buzzing with activity. Crew members were packing equipment, assistants were checking schedules, and in the middle of it all, still in his sparkly jacket from the show, was Michael Jackson. When he saw her, his face lit up with that famous smile. "Mrs. Collins," he said, walking over to her with his hand extended, "I'm so glad you could come back here." "I'm Michael." Helen shook his hand, amazed by how soft-spoken and polite he was. "It's very nice to meet you, Mr. Jackson, though I have to say I'm a bit confused about why you wanted to see me." Michael laughed, a gentle sound nothing like his powerful stage voice. "Well, you've been to my last 3 Chicago shows, haven't you? Front section every time?" "You noticed that?" Helen asked, incredulous. "Ma'am, when you've been performing as long as I have, you start to recognize faces in the crowd, especially faces that don't quite fit the usual demographic." His eyes twinkled with kindness. "May I ask what brings you to my concerts?" Helen felt herself relaxing. Despite all his fame and success, Michael Jackson was talking to her like she was a person worth knowing. "My grandchildren," she said simply. 8 of them, ages 6 to 18. "They're absolutely crazy about you, and I wanted to understand why." "And do you understand why?" Helen considered the question seriously. "I do. You're not just entertaining people, Mr. Jackson. You're making them happy. You're giving them something to believe in." Michael's expression grew soft. "That means more to me than you know, Mrs. Collins, especially coming from someone like you." "Someone like me?" "Someone who doesn't have to be here," Michael said. "Someone who chooses to be here. That tells me I'm doing something right." They talked for another 10 minutes about music, about family, about the responsibility of bringing joy to people's lives. Helen found herself completely charmed by this young man, who was so different from his stage persona, so thoughtful and genuine. As their conversation was winding down, Michael glanced around the room, then looked back at her with something that looked almost like mischief in his eyes. "Mrs. Collins, would you do me a favor?" "Of course," Helen said automatically. "I have one more show tomorrow night, the last show of the tour. Would you consider coming on stage with me?" Helen's eyes went wide. "Oh, Mr. Jackson, I couldn't possibly—" "Please," Michael said. "I want to introduce you to the audience. I think it would mean a lot to people to see that music really is for everyone, no matter their age." Helen thought about her grandchildren, about how excited they would be. She thought about Frank, who would have gotten such a kick out of this whole adventure. And she thought about the joy she'd felt watching Michael perform, the way his music had brought so much happiness into her life. "All right," she said finally, "if you think it would help somehow, then yes." The next night, Helen sat in her familiar spot in Section A, but this time she wasn't alone. Word had somehow gotten out to her family, and her 3 children and all 8 grandchildren were scattered throughout the arena. Every few minutes, one of them would wave at her from their seats, and Helen would wave back, feeling like the luckiest grandmother in the world. The concert was magical from the very first song. Michael seemed to have extra energy, extra joy, as if he knew something wonderful was going to happen. During Smooth Criminal, he even pointed directly at Helen and tipped his hat. The moment came during The Way You Make Me Feel. As the song wound down, Michael walked to the front of the stage and raised his hand for quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly throughout the arena. "Before we continue, I want to introduce you to someone very special." The crowd quieted, curious. "For 3 shows now, there's been a beautiful lady sitting right here in the front row," Michael continued, gesturing toward Helen's section. "She didn't come because she's a longtime fan. She didn't come because she loves my music. She came because her grandchildren asked her to, and she wanted to understand what made them so happy." Helen felt her cheeks burning as 18,000 pairs of eyes seemed to find her in the crowd. "Mrs. Helen Collins," Michael said, extending his hand toward her. "Would you please come up here and help me finish this show?" The arena erupted in cheers and applause. Helen sat frozen for a moment, overwhelmed by the noise and the lights and the impossibility of what was happening. "Go, Grammy!" She heard Tommy's voice screaming from somewhere in the crowd. Go up there! With the help of security guards, Helen made her way to the stage. Each step felt surreal, like she was walking through a dream. When she finally reached Michael, he took her hand gently and helped her up the final steps. Standing on that stage, looking out at 18,000 people who were all cheering for her, Helen felt something she'd never experienced before. It wasn't fear, though she probably should have been terrified. It was pure, overwhelming joy. Mrs. Collins, Michael said into the microphone, still holding her hand, tell everyone why you're here tonight. Helen looked at the microphone, then at the vast crowd, then at Michael's encouraging smile. I'm here, she said, her voice surprisingly strong, because my grandchildren taught me that it's never too late to discover something beautiful. The crowd roared its approval. And what did you discover? Michael asked. Helen looked right at him, this young man who had shown such kindness to a stranger, who had taken the time to notice one person among thousands. I discovered that music really can bring people together, she said. I discovered that talent and kindness can go hand in hand. And I discovered that my grandchildren have very good taste. The laughter and applause that followed seemed to shake the entire building. Mrs. Collins, Michael said, would you dance with me? Before Helen could protest that she didn't know how to dance to his music, the opening notes of Lady in My Life began to play. It was slower than his usual songs, more like the big band music she and Frank used to dance to. Michael offered her his arm formally, like a gentleman asking for a waltz. Helen took it, and for the next 4 minutes, she danced with the king of pop while 18,000 people watched and cheered and cried. It wasn't a complicated dance, just gentle swaying and simple steps that Helen could follow easily. But the grace with which Michael led her, the respect he showed her, the way he made sure she felt comfortable and confident, turned those 4 minutes into something magical. When the song ended, Michael walked Helen back to the edge of the stage. But before he helped her down, he leaned close to her ear. Thank you, he whispered. You reminded me why I fell in love with performing in the first place. Helen squeezed his hand. Thank you for showing an old lady that she can still learn new things. The rest of the concert was a blur for Helen. She watched from her seat, still feeling the warmth of the stage lights, still hearing the echo of all those voices cheering for her. Her family surrounded her after the show, everyone talking at once, everyone wanting to touch her like she was now somehow magical herself. But the real magic happened the following Christmas, when a card arrived at Helen's house addressed in careful handwriting to Mrs. Helen Collins, the dancing queen of Chicago. Inside, in that same careful writing, was a simple message. Thank you for reminding me that the best audiences are the ones who choose to be there. You made my last show special. Merry Christmas, Michael Jackson. Helen framed that card and hung it in her living room, right next to the photographs from the concert that her granddaughter Sarah had somehow managed to take from her seat in the balcony. Helen Collins passed away peacefully in her sleep in 1995, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. At her funeral, her grandson Tommy, now a grown man with children of his own, stood up to speak about his grandmother's legacy. Grammy taught us that it's never too late to try something new, he said. She taught us that keeping an open heart can lead to the most unexpected joys. And she taught us that sometimes the most important thing you can do is say yes when life offers you a chance to dance. After the service, as the family was going through Helen's things, they found a shoebox in her bedroom closet. Inside were her 3 Michael Jackson concert tickets, carefully preserved programs from each show, and dozens of newspaper clippings about her famous dance with the king of pop. At the bottom of the box was a folded piece of paper that none of them had seen before. It was a letter, written in Helen's careful teacher's handwriting, dated the day after her final concert. Dear Frank, it began, I wish you could have seen me tonight. I danced on stage with Michael Jackson, and for 4 minutes I felt young again. I felt like that girl you married 50 years ago, the one who wasn't afraid to try new things. I know you would have been so proud. I know you would have laughed at the sight of your wife up there with that young man, spinning around like a teenager. Thank you for teaching me to say yes to adventure, even when it scares me. I love you and miss you every day. Love, your dancing queen, Helen. At the bottom of the letter, in different handwriting that looked like it belonged to one of her grandchildren, someone had added, Grammy. We're proud of you too, and we love you forever. In 2019, 24 years after Helen's death, her great-granddaughter posted a video on social media. It was grainy footage from 1988, shot on an old camera from somewhere high in the arena. The video showed a small figure in burgundy dancing with Michael Jackson on that enormous stage, two people finding joy together across generations, across backgrounds, across every difference that might have kept them apart. The video went viral overnight, shared millions of times by people around the world who were moved by the simple beauty of that moment. The comments poured in from every corner of the globe. This is the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. Faith in humanity restored. This is why Michael Jackson was the king. But perhaps the most touching comment came from someone who simply wrote, "I'm 67 years old and I just bought tickets to my first concert. If Mrs. Collins could do it, so can I." Helen Collins never got to see how her 4 minutes on stage with Michael Jackson would inspire people decades later. She never knew that her willingness to step outside her comfort zone would become a story people told their grandchildren about courage and openness and the magic that happens when we say yes to life's unexpected invitations. But somewhere, in whatever place good grandmothers go when their time on earth is done, Helen Collins is probably still dancing, still showing people that it's never too late to discover something beautiful, still proving that the best adventures begin the moment we decide to trust our grandchildren's wisdom and let ourselves be young again. And Michael Jackson, who passed away 11 years after Helen, is probably there too, still grateful to the elegant lady in burgundy who reminded him that music really can bring people together, that kindness never goes out of style, and that sometimes the most important audience is just one person who chose to show up with an open heart.